Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Now, this is quite a famous quotation from a wonderful book. It comes from George Orwell's 1984, and I've been thinking about it a lot this week as I've been thinking about the importance of history. A lot has been written about history recently. Papers and social media have been full of what we teach and whether it is good or bad. They've also been focusing on what we could or should teach in order to help the ills of our society. I've been studying or teaching the subject for most of my life, and I've studied and taught a lot of different topics. What we teach really does matter, but I don't think that it is just what we teach that we need to talk about. I think we also need to look at how we teach the subject of history. The United Kingdom is a bit of an oddity. It is one of only a few European countries not to teach history right through to the age of 16. When GCSEs were introduced in the 80s, it was made an optional subject. Children in British schools then only have to study the subject up to the age of 14, along with every other subject. Now, there's no specific amount of time that must be given to history each week or month. To be compliant and pass inspections, schools must provide a broad and balanced curriculum, which is a matter for judgment. In the UK national curriculum up to the age of 14, history is taught alongside the following: English, maths, science, geography, modern foreign languages, design and technology, art and design, music, physical education, citizenship and computing. So history teachers, quite rightly, don't have a monopoly on time, and they are limited in what they can do. Many schools choose to teach less history whilst it is compulsory, to allow their students to spend more time on subjects which are compulsory at GCSE and which schools will be measured on in league tables. So we don't teach much history at all. This is quite tricky, as Britain has a lot of history to teach. So how do we choose which topics we should focus on? Well, it's largely up to the schools themselves, subject to the restrictions of time. The government is strangely quiet on what historical topics must be taught. There is only one mandatory historical event on the History National Curriculum: the Holocaust. Every British child must learn about the Holocaust. That's it. That's the only historical event that history teachers must teach. The Holocaust Educational Trust, which is a superb outfit, lobbied hard to ensure that it was put on the national curriculum when that national curriculum was drawn up back in the late 80s, and the topic has, quite rightly, remained there. Recent events have given every history teacher in the land pause. I think it's made us all think a little about what we teach and why we teach it. The national curriculum states that it is designed to provide pupils with an introduction to the essential knowledge that they need to be educated citizens. Perhaps the thing that has been worrying me most of all is who decides what knowledge is essential. I come back to that Orwell quotation. If you hold political power, then you can, to an extent, decide what students learn. When those students study history, as all do up to the age of 14, then you can decide what elements of the past they must look at, learn about and grasp. If you can do that, then, according to Orwell, you can help shape the future. Sir Robert Burley called history the most dangerous subject in the curriculum, and you can see why. Burley should know. He denazified the curriculum in Germany after the Second World War. Now, if you went back 100 years, British schoolchildren learned what is commonly referred to as our island story, a grand narrative in which everything that happened in British history led to the height of their Victorian British Empire, where Britain ruled the waves. This helped to ensure that generations of young people saw Britain as somehow predestined to rule, and to view other countries and peoples as firstly other, and secondly, less than. This method of teaching persisted for decades before being challenged in the 1970s by movements such as the School's History Project, which attempts to make the subject meaningful to young people by building a deeper understanding of the present by engaging with and questioning the past. To my mind, there are two major differences between how history was taught 100 years ago and how it is taught now. The first is that now, those who help shape the history curriculum are happy to talk about making it relevant. In the past, the history that was studied was just relevant because Britain was a major world player and it seemed logical to study a version of history that showed it reaching that elevated position, even if doing so meant leaving out some inconvenient truths. The other difference is that we now encourage debate, dissent and disagreement in how we teach our history. That can only be a good thing. I think that it is important to have discussions about what we teach and how we teach it. I agree with the school's history project that you can build a deeper understanding of the present by engaging with and questioning the past. Indeed, I'd go so far as to say that if you study history, you will build a deeper understanding of the present. I grew up in a working class family in South East London, which was a multicultural place back in the 1990s, as it is now. The history I remember being taught at school, though, was not especially multicultural. It followed the then national curriculum. At A-level, I did a lot of Tudors and 19th century international relations, which I loved. It was not perfect, but it wasn't malign either. It did teach me a lot about the world I was growing up in. Studying the relationship between the monarchy and parliament in Britain in the 16th century gave me a keen interest in the politics of the 1990s and a real understanding of power and how it had been and could be deployed. Studying the birth of nation states in Europe sharpened my awareness of competing identities in both the 19th century and in my own 20th. That's what history does. When it's taught well by engaged and enthusiastic teachers, it is full of relevance to the world we live in. It sparks conversations, debates and discussions. If you are keen and engaged, as I was, then you'll start reading more and you'll expand your knowledge. The classroom is only the starting point, and it can never answer every question you have. Hopefully, though, it can help you start to ask the right questions. The conversation around what we should teach in history classrooms has never really stopped. When Michael Gove was Education Secretary from 2010 to 2014, there was a huge discussion amongst history teachers, sparked by his often provocative pronouncements on what should be on the curriculum. Our current Education Secretary is being lobbied by many to include more teaching on black and minority ethnic history in the classrooms. There are some great pressure groups and think tanks out there who are putting their ideas and their plans forwards. The Black Curriculum and the Runnymede Trust, to name but two. The Runnymede Trust released a brilliant report entitled Teaching Migration, Belonging and Empire in Secondary Schools, which I commend to you. What we teach does matter, and I have no objections at all to there being more than one mandatory subject on the history national curriculum. If the consensus, after balanced and reasonable debate, is that the teaching of the history of migration, belonging and empire is made compulsory, then great. I am, though, always wary of any government exerting an excessive influence on what we teach in our history classrooms. Remember that Orwell quotation? I resisted Michael Gove's attempts to implement what appeared to me to be an excessively nationalistic reading of history back when I was head of the history department. I want a proper conversation around what we teach and how we teach it. Perhaps the reason that I want that balanced conversation is because whilst I do think it matters what we teach, how we teach it matters more. When history teachers engage and spark the interest of young people through whatever topics aid this, then they help those young people to understand the world. History is the most dangerous subject on the curriculum, but it is also the most exciting. Good history teachers encourage you to question everything. Good history teachers encourage students to empathise. History encourages you to try to understand the motivations of other people, people who may have been dead for hundreds or thousands of years. Empathy matters. The national curriculum's aim, remember, is to create educated citizens. To be an effective part of a modern, democratic, pluralistic society is to have empathy. Empathy is to understand why people act as they do, or at least to try to understand. It is not the same as sympathy, which is more to do with sharing a common feeling. You can empathise with someone and profoundly disagree with their point of view. If you sympathise with someone, then you do tend to agree with their point of view. Historians should always be empathetic. They may be sympathetic, but they don't have to be. Whether history teachers are teaching British history or medieval history, African history or early modern history, is perhaps not the key question. Good history teaching isn't about teaching facts. It isn't about teaching children what to think. It is about teaching them how to think, how to empathise, how to question. If we get that right, then the young people in our country will be set to understand the demands of a changing world. They'll be able to explore the large questions of their day. They'll be the educated citizens that we should all want them to be. Educated in how to think about their society, not necessarily educated in what they should or must think. I shall finish with a prayer by Jane Austen. Incline us, O God, to think humbly of ourselves, to be severe only in the examination of our own conduct, to consider our fellow creatures with kindness, and to judge of all they say and do with that charity which we would desire from them ourselves. I hope that everybody has a great weekend.